we come to Symbols 9, and we're making a kind of a motion which is like a spiral. In ancient Alexandria, it was discovered by an engineering genius named Archimedes that if you took a spiral shape and you put it into a three-dimensional form, this spiral would act in a way which we now recognize as a screw. It bores in. And as it bores in, it brings out levels deeper and deeper and deeper, so that a screw or a drill, anything like that, is the Archimedes principle of being able to pull things out from a depth that ordinarily would be damaged if you tried to just dig after it. Archimedes developed this in Alexandria. It became apparent at the time that this was an application of the ancient wisdom tradition of the Platonic dialogues, that talking together was not like a tennis game of batting a theme back and forth, but their cooperative movement going to deeper and deeper levels was like this Archimedean drill that was bringing up deeper and deeper aspects of what it was that they were trying to think about without the previous distortions that would come from a kind of a conflict, bludgeoning approach. Instead of just digging to get at something, one now applied this principle of the Archimedean screw, of the Platonic dialogue, to drill down and bring up materia from deeper and deeper levels, and that when one did this, there were not an infinite number of levels. There were, in fact, 7 levels that occurred. And on the 8th level, as one went down, what you found was clear ground. You no longer found the kind of content that you found before. So that the whole notion of a set of completeness included 7 parts with a concluding 8th part that was a repeat of the first part on a higher order. And out of this came the octave of music. The notes do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. The 8th note is the first note raised 1 degree in a scale higher. So that the octave is also like an Archimedean screw, and that if you arrange octaves together in a progression, you will find that the spread of that sound increasingly delivers to you the completeness of sound calibrated to sets of octave stages. The modern piano has a series of about 11 octaves on it. And the confidence is that the piano can play the entire range of hearable sound in a calibrated way so that the music is universal for those who hear sound within that perimeter and with a symbolic mind calibrated to the notes in the octaves, and that there'll be certain relationships of notes in those octaves which will deliver angles, special angles of insight, like in music, in the octave calibration of sound, thirds and fifths deliver really powerful, poignant relationalities. The grandfather of all of this was Pythagoras. It was Pythagoras who revolutionized thought in that area of the world. And he is an exact contemporary of the Buddha in India, of Lao Tzu in China, of the revival of Zoroastrianism in Iran. And you find the indications everywhere in the world at that time, around 500 BC, that there was like a wave of genius sweeping through the world. The history of how that then developed is the history of its transform being applied to the cultures and the kingdoms that had been there for thousands of years before, and which had a very settled way of dealing with things, and the settled way had a hierarchy headed by a king. The king was the most important figure, the pharaoh, the emperor. And so everything was in a social hierarchy, a cultural parfait that got more and more limited until it reached the top where there was only one man, the chief. When the Pythagorean, Buddhist, late Zoroastrian, Lao Tzu, Taoist transform came into play, that whole scenario changed irrevocably. And what happened initially was that it was a slight addition to what was there. After they came at about 500 BC, it was no longer just that the king was at the top, but that the king was at the top and remained at the top because he had a wise man behind him. And so the archetype changed. It changed from the divine kingship to a slight emphasis on the mysterious person of wisdom who taught the king, who informed the king of the deeper things, of the wider things, of the future things. And so you have a shift in emphasis that it is really the wise man behind the king who is the most important figure in a kingdom. So that ever after, wherever there were great kings, there was always a wise man with him. Alexander the Great, his wise man was Aristotle. King Arthur, his wise man was Merlin. And so it went. And so one can say that around 500 BC, the whole 2,000 some year period where divine kingship was the way in which power was contained, after 500 BC, it was more and more that one had to have someone who was really wise. But a wise man very rarely is independent and self-sufficient. So it became incumbent on the wise man to have a wise community of fellow seekers. And so the Pythagorean ideal was to have a community of people. The Buddhist ideal was to have the Sangha. The Taoist ideal is that there should be many esoteric people that come together from time to time, and they form like a secret society. The Zoroastrian revival at the time emphasized that there should be magi. So that communities of wisdom-seeking people who related to the wise man as their kind of king in a metaphorical sense. Out of this, the most powerful esoteric kingship in antiquity was Jesus. It was extraordinary. Was maybe about 100-fold more powerful and poignant than any of the figures between Buddha, Lao Tzu, Pythagoras, and the revival of Zarathustra. Zarathustra is very ancient, but he was revived at that time. So that the emphasis in the first half of the first century AD was that if this is the most powerful wisdom community in the world, and this is the wisest esoteric wise man in the world, why is it that he does not advise the biggest king in the world at the time? And the biggest king in the world at the time was Augustus Caesar, the founder of the Roman Empire. Now, Augustus Caesar, when he died in 14 AD. Jesus at the time was 22, 23 years old. The figure who took over for Augustus Caesar was Tiberius, his adopted son, Tiberius Caesar. Tiberius Caesar was an astrology freak. He constantly ran everything by increasing reductive suspiciousness on the basis of astrology, and finally his suspiciousness became psychotically focused on astrologers, and so he would take them down to one of his private resorts on the Isle of Capri, where he would have them accompany him up into this tower of this palace on Capri with the sole purpose of killing them there, having them killed. And that while they were doing this, they were to make a horoscope of the moment. And finally he ran across an astrologer who stopped and said, "Well, you're taking me up here to kill me." And Tiberius said, "Well, you're going to be my astrologer." But increasingly, the corrosiveness of the psychic situation ate away at Tiberius Caesar, and he became suspicious of the fact that there was evidently a focus of powerful wisdom in the world that was not working for him, and that there was going to be a very powerful king coming into the world. And it was a replay of a king who ruled in Palestine before, named Herod the Great. And he decided that he was definitely having some kind of a curse on his situation. He remembered that Herod had received that by now archetypally famous indication that a babe was going to be born who would replace the Roman Empire as the king of the world. And so the Massacre of the Innocents, all of the babies under 2 born in that area of Palestine were killed. They were all en masse, sought out, found, murdered. Because of it, and all of us know the story from our childhoods up, the father of the boy, who was a seer, removed the family to Egypt before his son could be killed, Jesus, Yeshua, and spent 5 years there until Herod died. Herod died in 4 BC. And while in Egypt, they didn't just stay in one place because they were exiles fleeing from power. They made a constant pilgrimage back and forth very slowly across the Egyptian delta and up the Nile River. And that this pilgrimage is replayed every year in Egypt by Egyptian Christians even now, today. It's the pilgrimage of the Holy Family. But that branch of Christianity is called Coptic Christianity. It's not Roman Christianity. It's not Greek Christianity. It doesn't have anything to do with Persia very much. It has almost nothing to do with India. It has to do with ancient Egypt. And the whole depth of the Archimedean screw of ancient Egyptian wisdom is that it goes back and drills down through all of the dynasties until it comes to the level where it penetrates through and comes out clear with no antecedents before it. And the place that it comes out clear with no antecedents before it is in a place called Abydos on the Nile River, and the first underground temple of the god of resurrection, Osiris, is located there. And it's called the Osirian. This is first and second dynasties Egypt. After the third dynasty, the Egyptian power center was moved away from it so that it would not be exactly there, and it was moved up to where Memphis was, where Giza is, where the Great Pyramids are today. But the Osirian was an underground place that had a little lake in it. It had a little pond that one had to go into this pond to be refreshed and cleaned, like a baptismal fount, the origin of the baptismal initiation, the immersion into that. And that after one came out of that, in the mystic torchlit darkness in the Osirian, one came out of that purifying initiation cleanliness and then had to go through a series of challenges from very nightmarish, scary, masked figures of powers, and to be able to brave them and then climb out of one's situation into the real world, reborn again. The Osirian's initiation is a symbolic accordion condensation of the journey through the netherworld. And in the earliest Egyptian pyramid texts, after death, one is prepared to go on the journey through the netherworld, and if you are successful, you will be then resurrected and reborn. And not just reborn, but the ancient Egyptian theology was that one is reborn each day fresh anew with the rising of the sun. And because Ra rises each day forever, you will be reborn each day forever. But you must be able to go through the journey of the netherworld, and the netherworld had originally a series of 12 gates. And at each gate there was a watcher who was the stern keeper of that gate. And you were asked a certain question at that gate, and if you could respond correctly, the watcher, the guardian of the gate, would admit you through the gate, but only to the next gate. And so you had to be able to traverse all 12 gates. That particular octave was 12. Later on in revisions, it became 21. 21 gates, 21 watchers, 21 guardians. That if you could pass through that gamut, you would have demonstrated enough symbolic savvy that you were ready to inhabit a life eternal. Because a life eternal has a great responsibility. Because a life eternal does not just happen in one place, like in one province or one country, or even on one planet. Because a life eternal happens in the entire universe as a whole. If you're going to live eternally, you have to be able to be at home everywhere in the universe. Because as you are reborn as you rise in your resurrection continuously. You may be anywhere in the universe, and so you have to show that you're able to live anywhere in the universe. And so a universal wisdom was the indispensable background before you could acquire life eternal. So you had to have universal wisdom. All of this resurfaced with a vengeance in the 19th century. It came roaring back. There had always been secret societies. There had always been eras where there were groups of men and women, where there were geniuses from time to try and get back to something, and no one really knew exactly what it was, but they had good intuitions, and they were very close. But in the early 19th century, following the American Revolution and the French Revolution, was an occult revolution initiated by Napoleon. Because Napoleon took a psychic insight around with him that he could found a whole new world order. He could get back to the original things if he could get back to the beginnings of civilization, which they thought at that time was in Egypt. But being Napoleon was not just a general, he was the emperor. He didn't like to call himself that at first. He called himself First Consul because that's what Augustus Caesar called himself. Augustus Caesar never said, I'm the emperor of the world. He just said, I am the princeps. I'm the first man. If anybody speaks on what to do, you will hear me first, and then you'll decide if you're going to agree with me or not. And because he has the armies and the power, you better be circumspect if you're going to disagree with the princeps. And so Augustus Caesar didn't call it the Roman Empire, he called it the Principate. This is the rule of the principal man in the world. And so Napoleon wanted to reestablish that. He liked that idea. And so he went to Egypt not just with overwhelming military force, but he collected what in French are called the savants. All the wise people in all the disciplines of the time by the dozens. And he took hundreds with him. And he took archaeologists, early archaeologists, he took linguists, he took philosophers, the early chemists. He took a whole army of savants with him and then turned them loose on Egypt. He said, I want you to find everything, find out everything, and bring it all together. And we will have it. And then we'll take it back to Paris, and then we'll have the world we want. And so Napoleon's expedition to Egypt was the beginning of Egyptology, of what became Egyptology. If you look up Egyptology in the Oxford English Dictionary, there's no usage before 1859 because it took a while for it to sink in. At first, people said, well, this is Napoleon's grand mania. This is his stuff. And what they found was packed together, and it was very difficult to come to some way to organize it. And so they found that the only man who had the mathematical genius to be able to organize the results of the Napoleonic expedition was the greatest mathematician of the day. His name was Fourier, who developed the Fourier transforms in calculus. And he figured out how to arrange all the material, the collections, into great big, huge elephant folio volumes with full elephant folio engravings, Denon, and Fourier was decorated for it by Napoleon with a great, huge sunburst medal. And whenever you see the classic engraving of Fourier, you see the Napoleonic badge because he had organized this great encyclopedia of ancient wisdom. Only one of the difficulties was that the esoteric symbolic understanding of all this was in hieroglyphics, and no one could initially read them. So Fourier put it all together, and it was awaiting somebody who could translate hieroglyphics. Champollion came along and was able to really bring out some of the hieroglyphics and did a fairly decent job, but it was like learning to read the symbols enough so that one could read, say, like on a newspaper level. Only the difficulty is that hieroglyphics are not newspapers. They are ancient occult wisdom texts, about as deep as you can get. And so it wasn't until the latter part of the 19th century that a group of very wealthy men in England, in London, decided we're going to take the New World away from the French. We're going to take Napoleon's idea for ourselves, but the key to it is that we need a wise man who can advise the head of the British Empire, not the king or the queen, but the prime minister who really runs things. So since there is no one like that, we will train one. And so they searched around. These very wealthy men. They had contacts with all kinds of families, and they found a prodigy. He was a teenager, and so they arranged for this boy to be trained by the best linguists in the world, and trained not just to read 5 or 6 languages, but to read them all. Especially to read the ancient languages like Hebrew and Syriac and hieroglyphics and Ethiopic and Coptic and Greek, Sanskrit, whole thing. And he turned out to be E.A. Wallace Budge. And when Budge was matured, he was made, in 1892, the active keeper of antiquities in the British Museum, and 2 years later he became the principal keeper of antiquities in the British Museum. Now the British Museum had, meanwhile, for about 100 or so years, had been looting the world of all of its stuff and piling it into its warehouses, piling it into its museum, until the British Museum on Great Russell Street in the near the Bloomsbury area of London was just pulsing with the loot of millennia. And here came E.A. Wallace Budge, like Fourier, but not a mathematical genius, a linguistic genius on the first order. Wallace Budge's 2-volume Dictionary of Egyptian Hieroglyphics is still in print and still used because it's very competent 100 years later. Really somebody. It was exactly at this time that London was undergoing an occult explosion, an occult revolution that was just explosive. And one of the triggers in that was the old grande dame of the occult movement of the world at that time, Madame Blavatsky. She had taken rooms in London, and her soirees had everyone who was interested in all these matters invited together, and knocking at her door one afternoon was a young man, a little thin in those days, the young W.B. Yeats, just a youngster. And she bade him to wait in the foyer while she finished conversations with some of the occult powerful people of the world in her living room. But being Madame Blavatsky, she was Russian, who had learned to roll her own cigarettes when she was still a nubile young lady, and learned to be tougher than the men who sought to dominate her. she kept half an eye on the young man in the foyer. And the young man in the foyer, already donning his poet's costume, a kind of a black velvet longish jacket with a double-sized big bow, and glasses that are called Nez-Pits that went on the nose and then would drop off on a little cord, and a shock of hair, and a kind of a serious, noble look. And he stood with his serious, noble look, looking at a cuckoo clock that had not worked for years and years, but Madame didn't want to get rid of it. She liked it. And as he stood there, the cuckoo came out and chimed. She put her cigarette out. She ushered everyone out of the place. And she told him, she said, I want you to start coming to my little evening soirees. And she gave him a time. And the time was a little after when everybody else got there. And when everyone else got there, he had not yet arrived. She told them all, you leave him alone. You let him say and do and ask anything, because he is one of the most special beings in the world. That's a true story. So in 1889, Yeats, by the time he had gotten into that, he had already spent about 4 or 5 years. He and a young friend of his that always went by the initials A.E., his name was George Russell, but he took the occult name for the Aeon, the great Hermetic time form of 2,000 years, 2 millennia, a pair of millennia. And he took the Latin spelling A-E-O-N, and he took the first 2, A-E, as his initials. And so he became a poet and a seer, and his most famous book is called The Candle of Vision. It's still in print after 100 years. He and Yeats in 1885 founded the Dublin Hermetic Society. They were 19 years old. And so they began to realize that they would go together to Madame Blavatsky's, to hobnob with all the powerful occult people of the world who collected there. It was very near the British Museum, and her place was like the British Museum of Occult Powers and Energies. When she died in 1881, it was like a signal that it wasn't that she was dead, but that the next phase was ready, and that's when E.A. Wallace Budge was made the keeper of the antiquities at the British Museum. He was the follow-up to it. And so, Yeats and A.E. and a number of people that had been seeing that the theosophical movement was very close to being something that was really interesting, but was more of a social level of things, more of an international nascent jet setter kind of, well, we know all about chakras and all of this, but that there was a deeper esoteric application. And so they founded the Pythagorean Inter-Community Center called the Order of the Golden Dawn. That was to be the creme de la creme of the occult movement. And into this movement came a number of very peculiar people. One of them was a man named, he used his initials S.L., Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers. Very handsome, very aggressively powerful. He was married to one of the most beautiful women of the time. Her name was Moira, and her brother was the great French philosopher Henri Bergson. But MacGregor Mathers wanted to really make this a powerful organization for himself, and people like Yeats and A.E. got him to leave, to move to Paris with Moira and do his occult stuff there. He wrote a couple of huge books on the Kabbalah there, and a lot of his books are still in print as occult classics, but he was one of the people that were quietly ushered out by Yeats. Another was Aleister Crowley. Crowley came in and was extremely glad to see there were some nubile young ladies like Florence Farr there. Her book on Egyptian magic is still in print. And Olivia Shakespeare, who later on founded the great bookstore in Paris, Shakespeare and Company, that published James Joyce's Ulysses. So there were a whole group of people, and the figures, the magicians of the Golden Dawn, one of the most famous occult groups in world history. And the real figure was W.B. Yeats. He said, after he threw Crowley out, he said, "Wisdom schools are not reform schools. We don't need to fool around with guys like you who are here for other reasons. You want the goodies? Go get them, not here. This is for reconstituting all of the initiations because we want to live forever. We want to be resurrected into an eternal life. And the key to it is the refinement of language to its universal poetic and the application of the transform of that poetic back into the symbols of the mind, all the way down, arcing down like a drill to the initiatory rituals, so that we will have body, mind, and spirit together and be able then to address ourselves as worthy of the cosmos. So this is what Yeats was all about. His initial interest, though, was not because of Madame Blavatsky or anybody else. His initial interest was because of William Blake. And it was William Blake that got him first. And he did one of the first great editions. This is Yeats's first edition of his William Blake, 1893. And Yeats was about 27 years old. And he says in here, and it's been disputed by scholars, but nobody's come up with anything else. He says at the very beginning that one of the reasons that he's interested is that early in the 18th century, a certain John O'Neill got into debt and difficulties, and these latter, apparently political to some extent, escaped both by marrying a woman named Ellen Blake, who kept a shebeen at Ramillies, Dublin, and taking her name, he had a son, James, by a previous wife or mistress, and this son also took the name of Blake, and in due course married and settled in London, and had 5 children, one of whom was William Blake. So here's Yeats going back and using his powers and his acumen to see that Blake was for him a kind of a harbinger of his own work. And so he teamed up with a man named Edwin J. Ellis. His book on the real Blake is here. And they did a big 3-volume work on the works of William Blake from a mystical angle, from a poetic angle, bringing Blake back, who had been almost ignored all of his life and ever since his life. And it was only by 1893, with Yeats's work, that Blake began to resurface and now is considered one of the greatest poets and artists in the world. Let's take a little break. We'll come back. Let's come back and try to bring ourselves into a little bit of large-scale esoteric civilization background and history so that we can begin to make a little more sense out of what's going on here and what all these things are for. 5,000 years ago, Egypt was synthesized along the Nile River with the delta. And it was apparent at that time even 5,000 years ago, that the Nile River was like the spinal column, and that the Nile Delta, with its 36-degree angle, was like a special opening of the spinal cord into the brain. So that in ancient Egypt, the flow of the water of the Nile and its inundation periodically and making the delta fertile gave to Egyptian civilization a quality that the essential transform is water, and that the essential transform of water goes through the netherworld. On the other side of the Arabian Peninsula and of the ancient Near East, of Palestine and Lebanon, on the other side, in the Euphrates and Tigris river valleys, what is today Iraq, they had a different index. Their index was not the netherworld, but the overworld. And its element, its key, was fire, the sun, stars, comets, heat. So you had two different indexes symbolically on the way in which transform would happen. In Egypt, because of the netherworld transformations based on water and on the land, on the netherworld journey of going down into the depths of things, Egypt developed alchemy. The word is Arabic. Al-Chem is the ancient name for Egypt. Whereas the Babylonians, the Akkadians, the Assyrians, the Sumerians developed astrology. They looked to the stars, to the heavens, whereas the Egyptians looked underneath, under the ground. The Egyptians looked to see the transformation by a refining fire that would help all the vicissitudes of the water phases to go through, whereas the Babylonian Syrians, they had the water of life that would be continuous but for a fire transform. And so the two great cosmologies that eventually became alchemy and astrology that were brought together and formed a braid which ever after was called the Hermetic Tradition. The way that that braid started was the touching of those two great civilizations by caravan routes. And the major caravan route at that time arced from the northern part of the Euphrates Tigris Valley, where the Euphrates curves over and comes fairly close to the beginning of the valleys that are there in Syria and southern, what is today southern Turkey. And there was a particular family that owned the rights to the central caravan route that arced over from the Euphrates, Tigris valleys into northern Syria and down the coast into Egypt. And because those caravan routes were established in the Akkadian empire of Sargon, of Akkad, Sargon the Great, about 2300 BC, after about 400 years, they had devolved to a special family, the patriarch of which lived in Haran, which was at the top of the arc in the loop, and his son was put in charge of running the caravan routes from Haran on over to the Mediterranean coast, on the inland, down the coast, but not on the coast. The Egyptians were still very powerful there, but inside, along a river valley, because they liked river valleys, the river valley of the Jordan River. And that man's name was Abraham. His father's name was Terah, and was one of the wealthiest caravan merchants in the world at the time. Abraham was the first to drive the caravan route all the way into Egypt. It was about 1900 BC. And when he drove it all the way into Egypt, there was immediately a disconnect because the entire civilization that he came from, that was matured in, was distinctly different from the Egyptian. In the ancient Akkadian, there was always a respect that it is the goddess who guarantees life, and so it is women who guarantee the quality of the way in which life becomes real, whereas in Egypt it was masculine. It is the god. It is the power of the god, not the love of the woman. The power of the male that keeps the order the way it should be, instead of the love of the male. And so there came a disconnect severely in the original Semitic tradition in the time of Abraham. And the disconnect was that one has a severe father if it gets too far, and one has a fawning mother if it gets too far the other way. And that there has to be some way to balance this out, and the way it's balanced out is that they learn to cherish life together. And so it is not the masculine or the feminine, but it's the family that is held together by the two aspects that weave together. And so the emphasis came in the early Semitic, by now it's the beginnings of the patriarchal Jewish tradition, that this was of paramount importance. The beast of burden at the time, by the way, was the old black-haired donkey. We've talked about this, and that was the original symbol for the Jews, the black-haired donkey, because it was the favored beast of burden that made the living for thousands of people and could go anywhere in the world at that time, was the workhorse. This is before horses came in, before camels came in. The black-haired donkey was the most trustworthy beast of burden for caravans. About 1,000 years after Abraham, you get Solomon. And at that time, it was the beginnings of realization that all great large civilizations had these time periods, like these 1,000-year millennial time periods. And so they began to try to find, where are we in these great time cycles of thousands of years? And by this time, the calculation was extremely refined and then became exacerbated after the Platonic tradition, the Aristotelian tradition, the Alexandrian Hellenistic Empire tradition, and by about 160 BC, that whole area of the world centered on Jerusalem was busy computing, like people of our time, the new age and what are we to look for. And so they looked back 1,000 years before the 150, 160 BC, and they went back to about 1100 BC. And when they went back there, the tradition that was kept alive was that there was a very powerful prophet who was born at that time and lived at that time. And his name was Samuel. And Samuel is the most powerful prophet after Moses in early Judaism. But as Moses was responsible to restore the Hebrew people back to the Holy Land, he himself was never allowed to go in. Whereas Samuel, in order to protect his advent, his mother consecrated him to the service of God and took him out of the human world, out of the human community, before he was born. And so while he was still in the womb, he was consecrated to the service of God so that he would never be subject to an ongoing reverberation of the restriction by God against Jewish prophets. We don't want to have the same thing of Moses. So he'll be consecrated before he's born, so he never will have been a part of the worldly community. He will have been raised from birth to the service of God. So Samuel was raised in a very esoteric community that positioned themselves on Mount Gerizim, where the caravan route came down, not quite on the Jordan River. By this time, this is about 800 years after Abraham, it came down just a little bit over from that. And so the caravan route had a couple of wells and burying grounds. And at the foot of Mount Gerizim is where it was possible to have, from Abraham's time, a place to bury one's dead and a well. And it's this well at the foot of Mount Gerizim that figures in the New Testament. That's where the woman of Samaria accused of adultery, where she is released by Jesus. He says, "Let he who has not sinned cast the first stone." And when no one could do that, he said, "I find no fault in you either. You're free to go. Live a better life." Samuel was raised on Mount Gerizim, and the place down below that was the ancient caravan repair center was called Shechem, one of the most sacred ancient sites in Judaism. That well, Mount Gerizim and Shechem. Samuel had a task to perform, and his task in his lifetime was to create a kingship for the Jews. And so he created the kingship, and the first king that was consecrated by Samuel turned out to be a somewhat power monger named Saul. And so Samuel, being the wise man behind the throne, said, "I take the power of the kingship away from you, and I give it to this young man named David." And so the early kingship in Judaism at the time of Samuel was all based on the context of approval and consecration by the prophet, who can make and break kings. The kings are there only because the emissary of God has approved, and because that emissary, being Samuel, who was consecrated before he was born, the name of that kind of a figure was a Nazirite. So 1,000 years later, they looked for a new Nazirite who will have been consecrated before birth to the service of God, who will create the millennial new kingdom. That's why he's going to be born. And so we are needing to have a special community of people who keep a refined calendric pace to make sure that they detect where he's going to be born and when. And so we are on the outlook for the new Nazarite who will come and establish a new kingdom of God on earth. A prophet. As soon as that kind of esoteric, energized, theological expectation got powered up, the power structure in Jerusalem, which was run as a branch of the power of a Hellenistic king named Antiochus II, he said, I don't like the way things are going here. I don't like that kind of talk. I am the king. My son is going to be the next king, and so forth. And so Antiochus II issued orders that the temple in Jerusalem be converted to a temple of his, that they will have Greek gods in the temple, and anyone practicing Judaism in that temple will be killed. And so the chief priest of the temple was driven into exile. He actually had to flee and went into exile for 20 years. Went initially up the Jordan River, past Mount Hermon into Syria, went to Damascus. And in Damascus had a vision, because it was also one of the great caravan route nexus. And his vision was that there needed to be a special form of religious retreat that the Hellenistic kingdoms could recognize, but it would have an esoteric Jewish inside. So the man who fled, we don't know his name. His name has been erased from every single document, but he's known to history as the teacher of righteousness, and he's the founder of the Essenes. But he chose as a form for the Essene community, an external form, not a Jewish tradition per se, but a Pythagorean mystical community tradition, because it would be recognized. And the Hellenistic kingdom political powers knew about these little harmless esoteric Pythagorean communities for about 300 years, and that they were located in many places of the known world at the time. And so the teacher of righteousness came down to where Qumran is, where the Dead Sea meets the Jordan River, and there established the Essene community about 160 BC. But in order to make sure that the community would be left alone and respected, the early Essene community there was more like a crafts community. They made things, they repaired things. And so the tradition was that, well, we have a lot of ascetic men who make things. They're certainly not going to produce some kind of a threat to anybody. It's a necessary place because the ford of the Jordan River where the caravan routes go over is not very far from there. Jericho's not very far from there. Jerusalem's just up on the ridge and the hill from there. What is today Amman, Jordan, is just over a little stretch of desert. And so the Essene community was set up as ostensibly a Pythagorean community of ascetic men that from time to time would take in other people, like women and orphans and so forth, and that they would care for them while they got themselves reorganized. But in order to make sure that the real purpose of that community was not forgotten and was pursued, an esoteric branch of that community, like the Golden Dawn of the Theosophical Society, a special esoteric branch was opened up outside of Alexandria. And they chose very well, because they chose a site that most people looking at this would decide that these were very harmless people. They had chosen a beautiful site, so obviously they're not like these teeth-clenching ascetics so much. They're very elegant people, and it's a community that has both men and women equally in it. And it was placed on a ridge in between the Mediterranean Sea and the end of the great lake, Lake Mareotis. Alexandria is on an isthmus between the Mediterranean and the lower part of Mareotis, and at the far end of it were all the expensive villas and the wineries and the wine estates. And it was a very gorgeous place. It was like a Santa Barbara of the day. And that's where the Therapeutai set up their community. And that was the esoteric inner branch of the Essenes. In order to give them a cover, the Therapeutai related not to Jerusalem at all, but they related to Alexandria. And the place in Alexandria that they related to had a very special kind of a tone. It was a Jewish temple called a synagogue, even in those days. It wasn't the temple, but it was a franchise, a branch, but it was the greatest branch of the temple. And that is the only surviving building under about 5 or 6 street levels of ruins and other structures from ancient Alexandria. It's called Nebi Daniel, the Church of Daniel. The reason why it's called Nebi Daniel is because the teacher of righteousness, in order to display a Pythagorean, Platonic, Aristotelian, Alexander the Great, sophisticated Greek language chutzpah, so they would be left alone, learned to write classical Greek as good as any of the classical Greeks had ever written it. And so he wrote the book of Daniel to be an Essene esoteric therapeutai dream workbook, so that people could not only get acquainted with the ancient tradition of being in the exile and coming back out, because this is all about a millennial exile and coming back out into a new time. And so he wrote the book of Daniel that had several different aspects. It taught the ancient history that we went into exile for 70 years and came back out to a better world, and we will do so again. Only this time, it's not an exile in geography for 70 years, but it's an exile in time for 70 weeks of years. And it's going to take a while for this to happen. It's going to take several centuries for this to happen. And so we have to set ourselves for the long go. The book of Daniel, written at Qumran, was very quickly taken to Alexandria, and that's where you find some of the earliest traces of the book of Daniel in ancient Alexandria. But he also had written a series of psalms, because the link was to go back all the way to King David, who wrote the Psalms. And so the teacher of righteousness also wrote a series of intense thanksgiving hymns, thanksgiving psalms, and they're called hodio in Jewish tradition. And they survive to this day, because they were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And when one reads them, one finds the torrential struggle and strife of the teacher of righteousness to survive, and to survive with his community, and to endure the merciless pressures and things that were besailing them. And because it was not just a Daniel expansion of vision in history, dream, and symbolic archetype, and the Thanksgiving hymns, millennial awakening psalms of the teacher of righteousness, he had to write a third book that brought those two back together, and the book of Job is the third book. He wrote that as well. And so the book of Job is the archetypal center of the wisdom of that whole esoteric tradition. When William Blake, who had been a visionary all his life and a rebel artist all his life, his friends included Thomas Paine, Mary Wollstonecraft, he was always a rebel. He always had a special mystical vision, and thank goodness that he had parents that recognized very early that he was never going to be just an ordinary kid, ordinary tradesman, so they apprenticed him to an engraver. And this engraver got a big commission, which was to last probably the rest of his life. His studio got the right to engrave the interior of Westminster Abbey, to make beautiful engravings of all the things. And so the young teenager, William Blake, was plunked down in Westminster Abbey and told to engrave all of these things: the tombs, the tracery. And so he learned Gothic architectural form because he engraved Westminster Abbey for 5 years. And when he was 21, most peculiar, miraculous thing happened. They determined that one of these graves was the oldest, was the original grave of Westminster Abbey, was the tomb of the last great king of Britannia, Edward the Confessor, before the Norman invasions. So here's this mystic William Blake, who for 5 years was engraving everything, and he was there when they exhumed the coffin, and they raised the lid. And not only was there the remains of Edward the Confessor, but when they peeled off, it was like the Shroud of Turin, the cloth had the impress of Edward the Confessor on it. And Blake, being mystical, universal genius, got it. This is how I'm to make my future engravings. Not engravings like those guys are doing on printing presses, but I'm to do a spiritual kind of engraving that will put reality on the page, so that when people address the page with their spiritual eye, it will imprint on their souls directly. And so Blake started making prophetic books. And he realized that you have to have color, you have to have, because the soul is alive, it's kaleidoscopic, it has all these aspects. And you have to have this flowing Gothic line. You can't have this geometric stuff. You've got to have lines that flow so that you get this river of life quality, but it also has to have the flaming fire, so you get the water and fire together. And he said, in this, what comes out is that energy achieves the form of the imagination in the mind. And that when energy is stabilized as a working, living form in the mind, the imagination sees truth, and what it sees is real. And so he needed, in fact, he was driven to it. We need a completely new mythology. Not these peasant mythologies that come from villages and farms and go on for culture after culture. We need a spiritual mythology for these new forms that have never been before. And he saw himself as the Samuel, as the prophet, to do this. It was a peculiar thing when the young William Blake understood that that was what was assigned to him, but it was doubly peculiar when the young William Yeats, who was also one of the greatest poetic geniuses of all time, got it that he was a successor to Blake. That is, Blake was the prophet of this new spiritual world that was to be brought in, that Yeats was likewise the successor magician who would make it possible for this to really happen. He would get all of the language honed not just to mythology but to poetry. Not just to symbolic forms, but to put them into magical conscious flows so that a completely new quality of mankind would come out of it. And he devoted the rest of his life to that. When you look at the relationship between Blake and Yeats, you realize that the arbiter is not that they shared a symbolism, but that their symbolism, their symbolic emphasis, yields a way to take experience through the symbols into the flow of consciousness so that consciousness can constellate art. And for that, the tradition had been for several thousand years the Hermetic tradition. Alchemy is an art. Astrology is an art. If you don't practice either as arts, then you're just dabbling with something. Then you're an amateur. But if you master both alchemy and astrology, the above and the below, then you have a chance at the grand art, which is the art of returning the spirit back to its cosmic home. That the arts and sciences have a relationship. The arts are to mature man so he can go home to the universe. And so this became a huge, enormous theme for Yeats, especially running across Madame Blavatsky late in her life. She had written the huge Secret Doctrine, a couple of volumes, the huge Isis Unveiled, a couple of volumes. But the figure that really is close to Yeats, it was the first secretary of Madame Blavatsky. He goes by the initials G.R.S. Mead. And G.R.S. Mead came out with some of the most startling books at the time. He brought out this book in 1896. It was the year that Wallace Budge was made the principal keeper of the British Museum for all of the ancient antiquities. It was a year when Yeats at 30 and his friend A.E. at 30 realized that they were old enough and powerful enough now as poets that they needed to have a real vision of how this worked. And obviously it wasn't just poetry, but there was initiatory ceremonies that were very close to plays, very close to spiritual dramas. And so there had to be some way to find a document that would be a model for them, and Mead published it. It's called the Pistis Sophia, published the first edition in 1896. Now, the Pistis Sophia is an esoteric, early Christian document from the early 2nd century A.D. And it was destroyed in later Roman persecutions of Christians. One of the most fierce persecutions was in 250 A.D. by Decius, even worse than that of Nero 200 years before. The Pistis Sophia was found in Ethiopia and survives in a Coptic manuscript. But the man who first found the Pistis Sophia, it's called the Askew Codex is associated with it, that was found in Ethiopia along with a codex that's now called the Bruce Codex, because Bruce was a traveler several hundred years ago in Ethiopia, and he found that there was an ancient, esoteric, primordial Christian tradition in Ethiopia that didn't come through Peter, didn't come through Paul, didn't come through the Greek Orthodox, didn't come through the Romans, didn't come through the Armenians, but came through an esoteric thread of tradition that went back to the Apostle Philip. And that a black Ethiopian prince came across Philip just shortly after Jesus was crucified in the early 40s AD. Philip was on his way. Philip was married and had 3 daughters who were all psychics, and eventually went to live on the Mediterranean coast, and the 3 daughters became some of the most famous psychics of the time. But Philip, the author of the Gospel of Philip, passed on this esoteric tradition and some documents to this Ethiopian prince, and he took it all the way down past the last cataracts of the Egyptian empire's reach into Ethiopia, around where Addis Ababa is now, and there it was safe for several thousand years. The Bruce Codex and the books of Jude and its Untitled Codex are published here finally in 1978 in Leiden, Holland, in the Coptic Gnostic Library. But the original translation of the Bruce Codex, part of it, was in the 1770s when it first began to surface from Bruce. And what surfaced first were 5 poems, 5 odes that are in the Bruce Codex, and they're called the Odes of Solomon. We know today that there are about 30. We have quite a few of the odes in some of the Psalms of Solomon. Why is that so important? Because Solomon's odes predate Jesus by almost exactly 1,000 years. So that the Odes of Solomon, which are written at the apex of maturity of Jesus in his life, are very much Solomonic literature. They're the cream of that whole tradition, going back that after the Psalms of strife of the king come the odes of wisdom of the wise man. And so one finds these Odes of Solomon written probably in the 30s AD, 40s AD at the latest, while Jesus was still alive. And I'll read a couple of them next week, and you can hear how succinctly powerful they were. For Meade, when he realized that someone like a E.A. Wallace Budge was in the British Museum in charge, able to read all this stuff. Madame Blavatsky was gone, but Meade was a young man. He was alive. He was enormously capable himself. People like Yeats and A.E. were there, enormously capable. They felt that this was the moment. And being in the late 1890s, they saw the 20th century as the time of the New Kingdom. We need to prepare a population of human beings ready to be able to be deep enough to inhabit not only the art of transformation and the art of understanding the universe, but the triple art of being able to come back into a personal spiritual form that will be at home in the entire cosmos. More next week.